officials attended the enthronement, where they publicly announced their claim to the historical and legal right to appoint what they called living Buddhas in Tibet. Authorities hoped to mold the Karmapa into a patriotic monk and use him as a mouthpiece for the Communist Party.
They just had huge, media sort of spinning around him from beginning, when the Karmapa was recognized by Chinese government and, took him to Beijing and meeting with Jiang Zemin, and 8 or 9 years old, Karmapa was praising the economic development in Tibet. At the time, they thought that this could work, by developing economic. They're grooming those Lama, and then we don't have to worry about the Dalai Lama, and then Tibetans will be happy.
The Karmapa spent his youth under the strict management of local officials, without access to the teachings and training he needed as the emerging spiritual head of an ancient Buddhist lineage. But he refused to compromise his religious education for the party. And like tens of thousands of monks and nuns before him, who fled over the Himalayas to seek a better education in the Tibetan exile monasteries of India, so too did the 14-year-old Karmapa in 1999.
It was a very daring escape, which was really embarrassing for China. And it's a great loss, I think, for Tibetans not to have him there in Tibet, even though now he's able to get a real education and a proper education that he, as a Karmapa, should. I think it's really unfortunate that China couldn't have allowed him a little more breathing room and that he couldn't have remained.
Even more influential in Tibetan society is the Panchen Lama, another reincarnation that China has sought to bring under its control. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the Panchen Lama shares a unique relationship with the Dalai Lama, in which the elder of the two is responsible for identifying and mentoring the younger. The previous Panchen Lama, Choki Gyaltsen, advocated for religious freedom throughout his life and spent more than a decade in prison for his criticism of Chinese policies in Tibet. After his release, he again devoted himself to restoring Tibetan identity and religious freedom until he died mysteriously in 1989 at the age of 50, just as his open condemnation of Chinese policies intensified. Despite Beijing's efforts to control the search for the Panchen Lama's reincarnation, over the next few years, Tibetans would smuggle information and photographs of the candidates to India for the Dalai Lama's consideration. And in May of 1995, the Dalai Lama identified the 11th Panchen Lama. His name was Gendon Choki Nyima. He came from a remote part of central Tibet called Nagchu, and he was 6 years old.
China waited a few days to figure out what their response was going to be, and then decided that this little boy should disappear.
Gendon Choki Nyima and his parents were abducted and taken to Beijing. They have been held incommunicado ever since. Authorities stated that the selection of the Panchen Lama was an internal matter, and that the Dalai Lama had no right to determine reincarnations. 6 months later, they staged a highly publicized lottery to choose their own Panchen Lama from a group of Communist Party-approved candidates. Their selection, Gyaltsen Norbu, was enthroned in front of Tibet's most sacred shrine in December of 1995.
Chinese communist, who doesn't believe any afterlife or any sort of religion in any sense. It's ridiculous. I know inside Tibet, these are painful, just interfering in a lot of people's belief system, a lot of people's whole cultural system. And, as much as many Tibetans in some ways are hostile to that, the boy appointed by the Chinese government, I think there's nothing to be blamed on this little child, which has been a tragedy in this political mess.
While authorities continue to groom Gyaltsen Norbu to be a patriotic Lama, Gendon Choki Nyima, now a teenager, remains under house arrest. Since the Panchen Lama dispute, monasteries are often required to display government-distributed photographs of the Chinese chosen Panchen Lama, and images of both Gendun Choki Nyima and the Dalai Lama are officially banned in Tibet.
It used to be in the late 80s that you would see photos of the Dalai Lama in the market, and by the mid-90s, the photos were nowhere to be seen, and they were nowhere to be seen inside monasteries. But if you knew where to look, you could find Tibetans just about always had photos of the Dalai Lama behind some other photo. And so it was always covered up, but they were still there.
While some Tibetans softly resisted state control of their religion by concealing photographs of the Dalai Lama from authorities, others resisted more openly. In 1998, Tibetans held a massive prayer ceremony for the Dalai Lama's long life near the town of Kanze in Kham, eastern Tibet. A local monk and scholar named Geshe Sonam Phuntsok organized the prayers. Tibetans in Kanze revered Geshe Sonam Phuntsok for his help with the reconstruction of several monasteries and the development of social welfare projects in the Kanze area. Over the years, he also taught Tibetan language to thousands of young monks, nuns, and children of nomads.
He attracted more attention from the authorities because they realized that this man was someone who had a lot of clout, and even though he wasn't political, neither was he totally under their control. And after these long life prayers, he was the target of the wrath of the party.
In October of 1999, Geshe Sonam Phuntsok was arrested for leading the prayers. Charged with engaging in activities to separate the motherland, he denied having ever advocated for Tibetan independence. His arrest sparked massive protest, resulting in a heightened military presence and increased surveillance in Kanze. At his trial, Geshe Sonam Phuntsok admitted to having organized prayers for the Dalai Lama, but argued that such activities do not harm the national unity of the People's Republic of China. He was sentenced to 5 years in Nakba prison. Despite the crackdowns in Kanze in the late 90s, in neighboring Setar County, the Larangar Buddhist Institute continued to grow. By 2001, more than 8,000 students resided at Larangar, which had become the cultural nexus of the surrounding lay communities. Larangar not only attracted Tibetans, but also drew more than 1,000 Chinese.
There are more and more Chinese people who have greater interest in religion in general, spiritual life in general, but in Buddhism and in Tibetan Buddhism in particular. And you can see that more and more people go to Tibet and want to learn more about why Tibetan people are so devoted into their religion and what's there for them.
Now this extra layer of implications that Tibetan Buddhism may going to have an impact in the Chinese society, and in that case, what does it mean to the state?
Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok's increasing popularity among Chinese Buddhists and the sheer number of monks and nuns at Larangar alarmed Beijing.
If people devote in the religion and have a large gathering, they are afraid they will turn into some political rebellion. They're fundamentally insecure of the land and the people who they occupy, and they want to control.
Despite the fact that the Institute had no history of political activism and carefully followed party guidelines with respect to the Dalai Lama. Larangar became the target of a campaign to decrease the number of monks and nuns permitted in monasteries. Monasteries no longer had to be politically active to come under attack. They just had to grow large enough to worry authorities. Officials ordered Khenpo Jigme Phuntsok to reduce the number of monks and nuns by sending them home. Unwilling to do so, he appealed to authorities to protect their freedom of religion in accordance with China's constitution.
The Chinese constitution has quite a lofty words, from freedom of expression, freedom of association, to freedom of religion. Yeah. But there is also a guiding line above that, which is the Chinese Communist Party is the leading party of this country. In other words, that's it. Whatever rest of say on paper, it doesn't really mean much, if anything threatening the fundamental interest of Chinese Communist Party.
Work teams backed by army personnel arrived in June of 2001 to implement the expulsion of over 6,000 monks and nuns, including all Chinese. Officials paid hundreds of migrant workers 250 yuan, about $32 for each dwelling they destroyed. With the demolition of over 3,000 residential quarters, authorities prevented monks and nuns from returning.
That was a really bad indication how far they are willing to go if they need to. Without international concern, I think China will have a free hand to whatever they want to.
Chinese people has the responsibility not only for a democratic government itself, but also to make sure the Tibetans and every ethnic groups the Chinese living with together, no matter what kind of political solution will come out, that they can live with, they are happy with, and their fundamental freedom and rights are being respected. And that is a long road.
I have great hope that China is really in the midst of a transition, and China will change. I believe so. I think they will see the value of Tibetan Buddhism as part of a diverse culture. It's not going to be a threat to the state if they be open-minded. But I think before we reach to that stage, I think Tibetans have to struggle inside Tibet, and outside the international community need to make sure that their voices be heard.